can masculinity also be used to counter mass violence and to serve a protective role in the community?
I want to tell a story actually, because when I read this one, something came to mind and I wanted to share. In Burundi, there is a little place called Buta, and in Buta there were seminarians, and one day the armed men came and they said to the seminarians, divide, Hutu one side, Tutsi the other side, and they didn't. And so they said, divide it up. We want to save the good one. And they said, no. They said for the third time, divide it up. We want to save the good one. You need to divide. And they said, no. They were all killed. And they are now remembered in Burundi as the martyrs of Buta. But I would like to contend that there is a different kind of masculinity and protectiveness in the choice of anyone who saves anyone. That is to say, in a strange way, I would like to move away from the idea that it is an interpretation of masculinity to be protective, or that there is an association of protections and masculinity necessarily, because you do have a lot of protection in motherhood, you have a lot of protection in gender's fluidity of many ways, and rather try to invite us in saying what is protective is actually the refusal to concede to the violent. Is this almost heroic, stern saying, no, I'm not giving in. You have a power to kill me and them and everybody else, but I'm not giving in. So even if I am not capable of protecting in a sense of avoiding us dying, I am protecting my own humanity and your own humanity by refusing to give in. So I am offering this because I think that there is a very important conversation to have about protection. What constitutes protections? When are we protected? And the reason I'm saying it is because I come from a country where protection is a dirty word. Protection is a mafia word. The mafia is the one that protects. You need protection because somebody comes to your store and say, give me money, otherwise your store will be burned. And I don't need that kind of protection. So I think that there is something about what constitutes protection in societies within the gender lens, within the gender, what are we protecting? And my hunch is the freedom to be. We are actually inviting each other to protect the freedom to be in form that may be unsettling more than we believe. And I know that I'm going in a sort of confusing way, but I think that the conversation is generative. So
I just brought to mind to me that since I'm more of a specialist on the Holocaust, of how perpetrators or the leaders of genocide can appeal to that protective instinct to urge people to commit genocide, so that committing genocide is actually a self-sacrificial act that you do for the good of your group, because you are in an existential conflict with another group.
I think we're actually reflecting a kind of revolution in thinking about masculinity that is the product largely of the scholar R.W. Connell, who urged us to think in terms of masculinities plural rather than masculinity as a kind of unitary institution, and distinguish between hegemonic and subordinate forms of masculinity. Quite clearly, hegemonic forms of masculinity have always been associated with power and dominance, and almost always militarism. It's very interesting to see, even at the level of hegemonic masculinity, the kind of fluidity and flexibility that can enter into behavior so long as that requisite of power and dominance is met. And the example that I think is particularly interesting there is male-on-male sexual violence, where the rapist is confirmed in his masculinity by being the quote-unquote active rapist, and the victim, who is cast into the traditional feminine role, is humiliated in his masculinity. But interestingly, even though participating in a homosexual act, which in a very macho society, as most genocidal societies are, would be viewed as being a betrayal of hegemonic masculinity, because it is done in a context of power and dominance, in fact, the rapist emerges with his hegemonic masculinity confirmed. I find that kind of an intriguing pattern. Very good comments, about, I think, about the protective role of masculinity. I think that there is a biological imperative at root there that I think in early human societies, in conditions of scarcity and great threat, there is a logic to pushing out males to the front, because the reproduction of the group depends above all on the preservation of fertile females. So there may be a logic going right back to the saber-toothed tigers. Read a book by Barbara Ehrenreich called Blood Rights, which is, I think, a really interesting exploration of the primeval roots of some of these gender and sexual features. I would just like to conclude by mentioning, drawing on the work of a scholar I haven't heard of much recently called Joan Cox, wrote a book back in the 1980s called The Oppositional Imagination. And one of the things that she pointed out that I thought was really interesting was how many models of masculinity we have that are in fact protective and nurturing. We've mentioned the fathering role, but the examples that she cited, gardeners, doctors, okay? Think about diplomatic and mediating masculinities. What does that tell us? This is not necessarily bellicose and belligerent, but compromising and negotiating and all of these things that are traditionally associated perhaps more with women. So there are multiple masculinities, and I think we need to be aware of the way that some of them may in fact have potential in terms of encouraging more constructive and nurturing and protective behaviors and less belligerent and bellicose and genocidal expressions of masculinity.
I think that this is something that we still need to understand in much greater detail. I think that our scholarship is somewhat lacking in this regard, and really understanding how this works out in particular contexts and what kinds of alternative masculinities are available and what the discourses of masculinities are and how those are being shifted and challenged and so on and so forth through genocidal violence. And I don't think that we understand enough, and I think there really is a danger in creating this kind of equation that is often equated between masculinity and perpetration and femininity and victimization. And so I think that's, I guess as an anthropologist as well, I'm especially committed to really trying to think about this in context, in historical and cross-cultural context, because obviously this is going to shift depending on what particular cultural setting and historical setting you're looking at. So.
It has to be case-specific, doesn't it? Or, I mean, you have to be able to get inside the unitary society, which is going to have a very different gender configuration than probably its next-door neighbor.
I like also Barry's warning in a way of saying, well, even protection actually needs to be carefully deconstructed, because protection can be used by genocidal violence to actually justify the perpetration. And actually, it is exactly because I want to protect and I need to protect that I then, intervene in that form. So it's
just to add on that, we see in many genocidal situations the need for societies to mobilize for their own self-defense, right? Because no one else is coming to their defense, at least militarily. And that can, down the road, lead to more violence, mutual genocides, when the protection of the hearth and home becomes attached to masculinity. So what initially starts out as a self-defense movement can very quickly radicalize into a counter-genocide, right? As particularly when the group defending itself against genocide is itself experiencing transgressions of their own hearth and home. And so you see, for example, in the history of the long history of ethnic cleansings in southeastern Europe, right? It was always this image of the penetrated hearth and home that became a battle cry, you know, as history developed for mutual genocides, mutual ethnic cleansings, constant violence between groups, right? And the reification of concepts of differences between groups, of senses of threat between groups. And so both this idea of masculinity justifying violence, right, or leading to violence, and masculinity playing a protective role, it's both can be very problematic when we're looking at the development of genocide over time, because it can connect people's identity, men's identities, to certain behaviors that are themselves genocidal, right? So that, yes, you have a situation where genocidaires can actually trick themselves into believing they are performing a protective function, right? And when there is historical evidence, right, manipulated, right, to sort of solidify that idea, right, then you have a situation where they're going to do this sort of stuff without thinking about it exactly, right, and see that simply as them performing their male duty of protection. So I think it's the association of gender constructs with certain behaviors that becomes the problem, right? When you yourself feel that existentially, to exist in the proper way or in a meaningful way, you have to commit certain things, particularly violence, and I'm anticipating future questions, but particularly humiliating violence, right? This is when, whether it's a femininity associated with that or a masculinity associated with that, this is when we're on the road, really, to genocide, and we can see a direct link between types of gender identities and the development of genocidal ideologies and policies down the road.
Could you talk just for a second about the femininities associated with that and how you see those?
Well, you know, we don't. this is a very difficult issue to tease apart. We don't have a situation where women are sort of, what would you say? Where women are, you know, leading the show, right? Most of the architects of genocide, right, have been men. And this comes out of patriarchal traditions and masculinist traditions of domination, obviously. And so we don't know what would women do, right? If we had a true matriarch, what would they do? We really don't know, and it's hard to say, right? But what we do know is that women have been leaders in genocides. They have committed sexual atrocities as well as others against victim groups. They have egged their men on. They've served as partners. That's John Roth's phrase, which I think is very useful. Partners in genocide. They've sort of been the cleaning up crews that go and steal, right, from the victims of genocide afterwards. They nourish, they support the men committing genocide, and they often provide the ideological justifications for genocide as well. And so, you know, if we're going to talk about genocidal femininities, we have to look precisely at this idea of protecting hearth and home and a perceived threat from a very identifiable group, right, that can be encircled and sort of targeted. And that, I think, shouldn't be underestimated. I don't want to equate, you know, masculinity and femininity in terms of their implication or the extent to which they're implicated in genocide historically. But we do need to do more research on the roles that women have played and look really at the ways that femininity are constructed and the ways those can sort of rope men into situations, right? But then also be the kind of motive force behind genocidal violence. Adam, do you have something to say about that, or Leslie? Sorry.
I just wanted to say it's very interesting that I think when women do get roped into those agendas to a certain extent, it seems to me, at least in a number of cases, that reflects in some ways their perceived vulnerability to sexual assault in particular. And I think, for example, of the role that women played in keeping the institution of lynching going in the United States, and how otherwise very progressive women would often present lynching as a necessary institution to protect white womanhood from the rapacious black man.
Absolutely. I was actually just sitting here thinking that I wish that I had my slides because I have this amazing image from the Museum of Communist Treachery in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, which is this sort of ideological propagandistic museum I guess museum is maybe not the right word, but space that was set up and to tell a certain version of history, legitimizing the genocide of 1 million Indonesians. And there's this bas relief, which is really amazing, which shows these evil, sexualized, demonized, politicized women doing this dance of the fragrant flowers that they apparently did before then slicing off the genitalia of army generals, and this sort of serving as this legitimation for genocidal violence to not only protect the nation, but specifically to protect the nation against the kind of destructive, undermining force of this kind of politicized, sexualized femininity. So in that sense, when we're talking about genocidal femininities, thinking about them in ideological terms as a legitimation for genocidal behavior. But then on the other side, it's a sort of time lapse. And then on the other side, you get President Suharto, who was Indonesia's dictator for 32 years, stepping in and protecting the virtuous women of the nation. So you see these images of, women sort of standing there cradling their babies, and they're dressed in this appropriate way, and it's a protection of that kind of femininity. So also the ways in which we can think about this as an ideological justification as well as the specific behaviors that men or women enact in genocidal spaces. So the kinds of stories that are also told, and the ways in which those are so very highly gendered oftentimes, and oftentimes have to do with protection, right? With protecting women, protecting virtuous women against the possibility of them becoming, unvirtuous women.